Hi, this is Jennifer Corey, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Living with Heart. And this week we have the supreme privilege of having Jan Stanley, both a friend and colleague of mine, here to talk about the purpose and the power of rituals. Let me start by introducing you to Jan. Jan is a woman who has so many talents that I wasn't exactly sure of where to start, but let me tell you about her amazing ability to weave together and work across the disciplines of positive psychology, leadership and organizational development, instructional design, and group facilitation, which is exactly what she does as a business consultant and advisor. She's also on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania's Master of Applied Positive Psychology program. She's a facilitator in the Penn Resilience program and a program leader for the Howe Institute Society's Next Gen Fellowship for Moral Leadership. And she's an advisor with a consulting practice called Eudaimotic by Design. And she's also a board member for Heart Initiative. So with all of these areas of expertise and all of these talents, the thing that I was hoping Jan would come and talk to us about today is about rituals. And Jan is a celebrant who brings ritual and ceremonies to individuals and organizations to both educate and elevate individuals, groups, and community well-being. And today we're going to be talking about rituals and how do they fit in to what we have going on right now. So Jan Stanley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jen. It's so great to be here. And what a lovely introduction. And your calming presence is always a beautiful thing whenever we are able to engage. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for that. So I was just telling Jan, just before we started this, that two things prompted my reaching out to Jan at this particular time. So as you guys know, we're doing this whole series called Living with Heart, just to help bring practical skills and tools and strategies for navigating difficult times, which is what we do at Heart Initiative. But boy, did it ever feel more appropriate than it does now, with everybody navigating COVID-19, dealing with a pandemic in its own way. And as Rick Hansen and I were talking about just 2 weeks ago or so in our interview, we may be all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. Mm-hmm. And so different people are having to navigate this for a whole host of circumstances in all sorts of different ways. And one of the things that I've had a personal encounter with on many levels is the loss of ritual. And I have a neighbor, Jackson, just this delightful young man who's 17. This is his senior year. And I saw Jackson the other day and I said, I am so sorry about graduation. I'm sorry about prom. Think of all of the things that a 17-year-old is missing out on right now. And, he did what I've heard a lot of people do, Jan, which was he kind of poo-pooed it. He said, it's no big deal. I was like, and I understand where that's coming from. Hey, in comparison to what's happening, it's no big deal. But of course it is. And then there was the added element of my daughter, college graduation, and the loss of that. But really, for me personally, the big one was the passing of my cousin just 3 weeks ago. And at the same time, he passed away, and this article came out that you're featured in, written by Jill Sutter for Greater Good magazine, called What Happens When We Lose Our Social Rituals. And it suddenly clicked for me. Oh, there's the added loss. There is the loss that we're all experiencing. And I couldn't think of anybody better to speak to about this than you. You're referenced in the article, and this is really an area that you have expertise in. And I thought, could we start by talking to people about the evolution of rituals and our own human evolution? Why do they matter? Why do we do them? What is it in us that draws us to even engage in rituals?
Absolutely. That's a big question, Jen, and let's dive right into it. So I think as some of the examples that you gave are what I would call societal rituals or community, family rituals that engage many of us together. And through history and true to today, some of the benefits of having those societal rituals is that they draw us closer together. We feel like kindred spirits. We feel of one shared heart and mind when we're participating in some of those rituals. They also offer us an opportunity for us to become closer to our community. So I think of your neighbor Jackson with the graduation ceremony, and we can talk about what are some substitutes, what are some things that might be different, but maybe accomplish the same things in a different way as we get into the discussion. But one of the things that he will miss out on is the opportunity to make an important transition, to have a milestone, kind of in graduation, the moving of the tassel signifies I was a student, now I'm a graduate. But he'll miss the community witnessing that. So there are ways that affects us very deeply. We might not even think about it at the time. We might just think like, woohoo, graduation, that was great. But there's good research, both culturally and psychologically, social psychology, et cetera, around the importance of the community bearing witness to some of those important moments in our lives.
So rituals are not just some luxury item. This is what I understand you saying. This isn't a luxury item. It's really been, it's evolved with us over the course of our human history. We've been doing it long before we ever had formal names for it or anything along those lines. I mean, it's like ingrained in us, isn't it? To want to honor and mark things in a particular way.
That's right. Think of gathering around the fire pit, eons ago, or think of the traditions of sharing stories through the generations that impart particular values or lessons or meaning for our culture, our society. Those are types of rituals that have a historic bent to them. What's interesting though, Jen, is that there's a lot of new research on rituals. So now that we have a flourishing of science in our world, people have recognized, wow, what is it about these things that brings people closer together, that seems to reduce anxiety or heighten pleasure? And so they've actually begun to study ritual in the lab. And what they found, I guess if I would take multiple different studies and kind of generalize to one common element, is that they can take our big, messy, chaotic lives, even more so in the time of a pandemic, and give us an opportunity for a little bit of control. So when we do a ritual of remembrance, when we do a ritual of connection, when we experience something deeply, it has the benefit for us of calming us, of reducing our anxiety, because we're doing something that we thought to do. Maybe we're doing it at the same time each day, and it helps put an anchor into our day. It helps us maybe connect to something that's valuable to us, to someone who's valuable to us. And so the research is building, and I'm delighted about that.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things that we do, but we don't necessarily have to step back and think too much about. You get the invitation in the mail, or the opportunity comes, or there's a passing, and you automatically know. It's not, I don't know anybody who wants to go to a wake or a funeral, but I'm not sure about Shiva. My mother was Irish and Catholic, and we decided to have a Shiva for my mother because it's such a meaningful and beautiful ritual. I was going to say maybe people don't want to go to a Shiva, but I actually think maybe you do in a way, because there's such warmth to it. But when I think about the things that people have had to let go of, I think the graduations, the bar and bat mitzvahs, what were some of the other ones that we've lost in this particular time that again, I think it's so easy to certainly weddings.
The milestones of life,
April,
right?
May, June, July. I know a number of people who opted for civil services because, getting married was the most important thing. But imagine to have to give up something that you had been planning for a long time. And I think that there are even smaller ways in which we have these rituals that we don't often think too much about. And so can we talk about the relationship between ritual and happiness. One of the definitions that I heard was, and this is Shira Gabriel's work, rituals are choreographed events that create shared, emotionally rich experiences. And so they actually play a role, don't they, rituals, in our own, as you said, elevated experience of happiness. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So if you think about the idea of being together with a group of people, and there are ways to design ceremonies and rituals that will help us kind of enter in to a space where there's shared emotion or shared experience, and then help us leave that space. So it's not abrupt. It's not just something where suddenly we're speaking or experiencing something that, you know, we had no idea was coming forward. So there's a good way to do that design. But there's a term that's called collective effervescence. And it's kind of a mouthful as a term, but I bet if people stop and think about it, they can think of a time where at a wedding, at a sporting event, at a school assembly, at, you know, different points of gatherings where we suddenly feel kind of connected to one another. We have the same spirit. We're moving in the same kind of energetic direction, so to speak. And it is a moment of transcendence. It's a moment of elevation. So we leave uplifted. And I would say that even in, now I'm going to take pre-COVID days for a second and say, even in funerals or celebrations of life, for a long time I taught funeral celebrancy for an organization called the Celebrant Foundation and Institute here in the US. And one of the key aspects of conducting funerals and celebrations of life is writing eulogies. So when you construct a eulogy, a good eulogy, I used to say when I would teach these things, is one that pays tribute to the person who you've lost. It passes the gut check. In other words, you're not saying, you know, this person never had a harsh word for anyone, if in fact that wasn't true, but you find ways to make a tribute. So maybe you turn that into something like their standards of excellence really showed me what it meant to be a parent, or what it meant to be a woman or a sister, or whatever that happens to be. And so it's kind of paying tribute, it's passing the gut check, and a good eulogy, a good ceremony, a good shared ritual helps us feel uplifted as we're leaving. So we've experienced something, we've connected in a way that we leave wanting more of that. We want to be a better person. We want to have continued experience at maybe an elevated level than what our day-to-day life turns out to be. Now, with the pandemic, of course, we are not having the experience of in-person large group gatherings, celebrations of life, funerals, etc., wakes, even burials when we lose someone. And so when you think about the levels or layers of loss, there's sort of the loss of not being with the person, perhaps, frequently now in COVID-19 times. There's the loss of not being able to say your proper goodbye, or now there are the brave healthcare and chaplains who are working in our healthcare facilities are often using FaceTime and phones to help convey those messages. But it's almost like a moral injury to someone if their value system, I said, you know, till death do us part in my vows, and yet I'm being kept away. And so there are different layers of loss. Then when you go forward into the celebration of life or the funeral, and you realize that you're not able to have that, it's another kind of disappointment that, I shouldn't even say disappointment, it's beyond disappointing. It's another extreme loss of you don't have the community around to help you, but also to pay tribute in a way. And yet, Jen, people are finding silver linings. So a woman had a burial service for her father recently, and there were 7 people, 7 close, like the inner circle, and they all had to social distance, the people who didn't reside together. And she said that when she went to the experience, she was feeling so trespassed and anger, and why did it have to happen this way? And as the burial happened, as the ceremony transpired, she realized, this is exactly what my dad would have liked. He would have really liked having just the small group of the people who were closest to him present, and a very simple ceremony. He never was one for big hoopla around things. And so, it takes a level of emotional agility, I guess I would say, in order to do that reframing. But some people are finding ways to take the current system, the current circumstances, and have not, I wouldn't call it beneficial outcomes, but have outcomes that, are the best that they can be, and they come to some level of acceptance with that.
Yeah. This time certainly is requiring a kind of emotional agility on our part, isn't it, Jan?
Mm-hmm.
And things that I think we took for granted or didn't think a lot about, we're now really confronted with in terms of the losses. I like what you were saying about, there's the loss and then there's the compounded loss, right? We can have these losses on top of it. And so I wondered, it seems to me like this is a really good place to turn in the road to talk about, okay, so now we know what we've lost. Is there something? What, of course there is, but what can we build? What kind of rituals can we build given the current circumstances? And the things I'd like to talk a little bit about are those things like graduations, although I think some of the schools are doing some really nice things, right, with parades and car parades and signposts and all that, but with funerals and end of life events as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. And let's take graduations first. And I am so happy to see the kinds of things that are happening out there that people are reporting about graduations. And when you think about this important milestone in a young person's life, let's talk about high school graduation, for example. It's often the tradition of showing up for the ceremony, and then on perhaps the day following, or maybe later that day, having a series of open houses, or people go from one house to the other. Of course, they won't be able to do that now in terms of social distancing, unless they are those parades or things happening through the cars. But when you think about the idea of ritual, both as an individual graduate and as a family or as a community, you can start to think about what are the ways, what are the rituals that we could help in this transition. So the transition from student to graduate, the transition from maybe being in high school to whatever the next steps are for that particular young person. And so what if you could create it in a way that turned out to be meaningful, but in a different way from the traditional? So I think of things like, what if the close friendship group within a student community all created stories or shared stories about what inspired them about one another while they were high school students? Or what if family members collected mementos, maybe it's greeting cards or something that stimulates a memory of what this young person was like when they were younger, and created a slideshow or a composite video where all the different elders and peers within the family are sharing stories, some that would be touching and, remembrance, and some that I'm sure would be hysterical and funny and have, elicit all kinds of emotions for the graduate. So I think there are just a lot of different ways that you can go about doing that. And I would say this as a caution. I'm sorry, I'm having an earpiece little challenge here, but I would say this as a caution that I don't know about you, but for me, I do a lot of Zoom meetings. So I'm doing Zoom meetings kind of from morning till evening. And so Zoom or other kind of web conferencing solutions are amazing. They're really like miraculous. Think if we didn't have them, they are enriching our lives. They have in the past and even more so now. But when you're doing something that's more sacred or more, that's more of a ritual where you're really coming together as a family or a community, it's not just another business meeting. I think you can use Zoom in a way that is sets off the kind of experience and mood and space for those events to happen. So I would love to see, I'm a big fan of the celebrant idea, so someone who specializes in ceremony and ritual, but often each family or each community, each neighborhood will have someone who can step up into that role quite easily and open the time together in Zoom instead of just, well, how's everyone doing, kind of thing, but really set the stage, really frame the experience in a way that is not only sad. So, and let's talk about graduation. It's not only, oh, we can't do this. I'm so sorry. We won't be at the field today. It's those things are all true, and an acknowledgement of that is fine. But it's also an opportunity to connect with one another in a different way. So someone who can kind of create that experience for people, and then design it in a way that has those moments of emotional uplift, I think.
Mm-hmm. And any thoughts about doing something similar for an end of life, for supporting a family who's going through a loss, or how a family can come together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about end of life, and then I'll talk about after death. End of life is probably the area where my greater community, my family and friends, etc., I get contacted about someone in my circle is, dying, has days or weeks to live. What do you recommend? How should I be with that person? What should I say? What should I do, etc.? And so there are lots of things that you can do in the presence of someone who's dying that's really, beautiful. So things like sharing memories, playing favorite music, reading aloud, all of those things that we maybe can't do right now if your person is dying in a hospital. And so the idea of using ritual as a substitute is a really good one. So while I don't think most healthcare facilities are staffed for healthcare providers to do hour upon hour of FaceTiming, maybe you could do a recording, and the healthcare practitioner could, play the recording so that the person has the music or the words that you're saying, those sorts of things. And for you, if you're the one who's at home and not able to be in the hospital, I think some of the things about ritual are that there's an action involved, but there's a symbolism with that action as well. And so though you can't be together, holding the person's hand, your loved one's hand, what if there's an object? What if it's a wedding album? What if it's something that was the person's favorite pillow or t-shirt, or, whatever it happens to be, that you can have near you, and you can begin to process and kind of share those thoughts and feelings in a way that might be even more freeing than if you were in the hospital room too. But of course, it's not the same by any stretch of the imagination, but it gives you a chance to feel that presence. And I think the thing about ritual, one of the things that, one reason it's been discounted is because people sometimes think of it as like magic, or something that is like, if I do this, then suddenly everything would be okay. And of course, that's not the case at all. But the idea of doing something symbolic is really helpful in kind of helping with that passage, so that when the death occurs, it's not just abrupt and you haven't had any opportunity to begin the process. So those are things for end of life. Yeah.
When you said that, you made me think right away of prayer.
Yes,
that,
exactly.
When we pray together, sometimes people are praying for a specific kind of outcome, but the I don't know if success is the right word. The comfort around prayer is the act of knowing that people are doing something with a similar intention together at the same time, even if they're not in the same room. And I remember when I was having surgery a number of years ago, a trusted sort of elder and counsel mentor to me in my life said, "I'd like to do something for you if that's okay." And he said, at the time that I was going to go in for this surgery, I'd like to bring together all the people who are important to your life so we can pray together. And so they all get on a phone call together. Now, obviously, I was not a part of that call, but I remember the warmth that I felt knowing that people who loved me had gathered for that purpose. Yeah.
I've done similar distance when families are geographically apart. It's been before the COVID-19 time, but very similar, where we bring the person to mind and share our prayers, good thoughts, intentions about, the experience that they're about to undergo. That's a beautiful example, Jen, very beautiful. And I do want to say there is, I don't think the focus of our conversation is on the healthcare providers, but there are levels of kind of distress that they're experiencing in all different ways. And I think a carefully crafted ritual could help with those. So I think early on in the COVID-19 times, when we were first realizing what was happening and the quarantines and family members weren't allowed in, I heard healthcare providers share stories of how in their training, this person was about to die alone. And so as a human to human, the idea of taking off the mask, taking off the gloves, and holding the person's hand is what their instinct was. But of course, they weren't allowed to do that it's putting them at risk, which then puts other patients at risk. And so there was a shift that had to occur between my role is the best possible care I can do for one individual, to kind of broadening that and thinking about my role is how to care the best I can for the most individuals who are here under our care in this particular facility. And what that created for people was angst and guilt and a moral injury of not fulfilling what they felt was something to do, one human to another. And so hospitals are thinking of creating rituals to help people process those experiences. In fact, one that I'm aware of is called moral resilience rounds. So, in the hospitals and clinics, they'll do rounds the next day to talk about, what happened with each of the different patients under care, how are they doing, et cetera, what are their signs. And so they've added components about what has your experience been like, and, moments of silence, moments of connection for the healthcare providers who've had to do monumental service and make monumental mindset shifts as well.
So one of the things that I hear you saying is that rituals also can have a real resilient component to them. And maybe it is because in part of that shared experience that people are having, but that there's that real opportunity for it to, as you said, the uplifting of it, and maybe also, Jan, a meaning making out of what people have experienced.
I think that's exactly right. So a transition between the person who felt guilt for not doing, not behaving in a way that they might have 6 months or a year ago, and transitioning that into look at this collective care that we're providing for our community. Look at the number of lives we've saved. Look at the number of people we're helping, et cetera. So that's a real way to connect to kind of a positive contribution, or to make meaning, make the efforts that seem like not in keeping with our training, to put those in a broader context of what it means for society.
Is the clapping that's happening in many urban places at 8 o'clock at night and things like that, is that a ritual?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. The music that people are playing, the clapping, it's a way of saying, look, we're all going through this experience together. And even though it's tough for us, even though we each have our own levels of loss, our own levels of sacrifice, one of the things we can do is look for the things that we're grateful for, or for the people who are out there doing, just terrific kinds of services on behalf of people who are ill, or people who need food, et cetera. And so you're exactly right. Those social rituals are really powerful. I don't know if you've participated in any or not, but it's a really amazing thing. And I love even watching I feel elevated even watching videos of communities that are doing the nightly clapping, or where they're doing a shared song. I remember one from Spain and Italy, and it's just really uplifting.
Yeah, and the kids painting the rainbows and putting them in windows. as a
That's
sign of
right.
thanks, right? So we go back again to that idea of a choreographed event, that has this emotional kind of uplift to it. Can we talk a little bit about specifically around funeral rituals, things that we
Yeah.
can do in place of what we have always done given the present circumstances?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, right now, in most communities, there are no large group gatherings. Now, I know different states are doing things differently, even as we're recording this, but I don't know of any jurisdiction where they're allowing groups of hundreds of people to gather, as you might for a funeral. And then there are graveside or crematory. There are all the kind of ceremonies of disposition, kind of what happens your belief tradition, in your loved one's wishes at the end for their body. And those can be gatherings with social distancing of 10 or fewer in most jurisdictions that I'm aware of. And so a couple of the things that are happening, Jen, there is a new kind of social ritual called mourning circles, MOURNING, mourning circles, that are using an online platform like Zoom. And in many cases, they're being thought of as a way to process our emotions now, and as almost like a placeholder or a way to begin and continue the grieving process, the mourning process, until such time as we're all able to be together again. What some people are finding and reporting from doing these types of rituals is that they're so powerful, and that the memories and stories that are expressed by family members are the things that you might have heard one or two of them in a larger gathering, but using a platform like this, you're hearing multiple people share what was most meaningful about that person's life. So the mourning circles are definitely one for a social gathering that use the online platform. I know different faith traditions are offering streaming of different group gatherings. So if there are multiple deaths in a particular care facility, or in a particular church or temple, that sometimes there are ways of saying, on this day, we're going to have this group meditation where people are invited. And again, it's a way to begin the process. Even if you have in-person funerals, as you well know from your background, it's not the end all. Now we leave the funeral and we're good. We're, better, no more mourning, no more grieving kind of thing. But so any of these things that we can do that help us move the process forward in terms of grief, and that pay tribute to the person that we really loved and that we wanted to stand by, and maybe don't feel we stood by in the way that we would have desired to do. So those are examples. On the personal side, there is some good research by Michael Norton and Francesca Gino, who did research about rituals and grieving. And of course, they couldn't induce grieving in people. That would be too harsh of a psychological study. But what they did do is they worked with people who had experienced a great loss. This is before COVID-19. And they asked them to write about what it's been like since then. And then they did different scales. They measured kind of their feelings and emotions, that sort of thing. And what they found is they expected people to write about, the times where they couldn't get out of bed, and the times that, they spent crying, and people did write some about that. But what they found mostly is that many people wrote about ways that they were keeping the love for their lost loved one alive. And the example that always comes to mind for me is a woman who lost her husband, a lifelong husband, many, many years married. And she was having a difficult time with grieving, as we all would in that circumstance. And I don't even like the way I phrased that, difficult time. She was grieving. It's not necessarily a judgment on it. It's just the thing that we as humans need to do. She was grieving. And She realized one Saturday as she woke up that, this was the day when my husband would always take the car to the car wash. So it was nice and clean for us in the week ahead. And so she was feeling that loss and feeling that longing and what she was missing out. And she decided, you know what? I'm going to take the car through the car wash today. And that became her ritual, her Saturday morning ritual. She began to enact what her husband had done. And what Norton and Gino found is that people who found personalized rituals that were unique to their situation, actually the duration and the intensity of their grief as they reported it was lessened. And so I think to the extent that we can find ways to really honor, remember, keep the, one aspect of that person's legacy alive by a ritual, it can be really helpful for us. And, it's a joyous thing because the person, we're learning to love them in a different way. We loved them when they were physically beside us. Now we're learning to extend our love in a different way through ritual.
Oh, that is so beautiful, Jan. I love those suggestions. And let me share two that I've personally experienced.
Great.
One is there's a local place here in Red Bank, New Jersey called Steffi's Place that was started by Sheila Martelli. It's a grieving center, and Sheila is a 9/11 widow. And she and a group of 9/11 widows and mothers who had lost their children in 9/11 started this together as a way of giving back what they had been given during their period of loss. It's such a beautiful center and agency, and it's such a worthwhile cause. And there is no charge at all to the people who need their services. They live only on donations. And it's so powerful. But
amazing.
Sheila wrote a piece maybe a few weeks into the quarantine and said that the same way, we're in New Jersey, and so we've been hit pretty hard, not nearly as hard as New York and Manhattan in particular, but we are not too far from there, probably about 25 miles from Manhattan. She said the same way, and so we were dealing with losses early on. Sure. The same way that we are driving around beeping horns and circling homes when there is a birthday to celebrate, we need to find a compatible ritual when there has been a death. Mm-hmm. And I was so struck by that. And I mean, really, the truth of that was so powerful. But of course, beeping horns didn't feel exactly right. So when my cousin, Jimmy Sakanos, unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago, I mentioned this to my siblings and my family who live in the area, and we all agreed to drive down to his parents' home, which is on Long Beach Island, and to all of us stand 6 feet apart, masked and well covered, holding candles, but just standing around the entire edge of their property.
That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. And then singing, Amazing Grace. And then that was it. And then we quietly left. Mm-hmm. But I know, and I've heard from my aunt and uncle that this was so meaningful to them to realize that they were not alone. And it was the most that we could do at that point in time. There was really nothing more. So to have that to be able to do, and I think there was something else I was going to share, but it escaped me. So if it comes back, I will.
Let me offer a comment while you're thinking of it. Maybe it'll come back to you, but the last example of holding the candles, that is so beautiful. And when you think about social rituals in particular, this idea of collective effervescence, or this idea of shared emotion, shared experience one to the other, you can also look at it across a timeline. So there's a temporal effect to that as well. So we wouldn't wish deaths from this terrible disease on anyone. So that goes without saying. And of course, I know I've shared condolences to you about your cousin. And yet, when Jimmy's family thinks about that ritual that you did, it's going to be just etched in their hearts for the rest of their lives. What, meaningful, emotionally laden moment that you created for them that was in support and out of love. And so it's the same for our graduates who aren't getting a graduation ceremony. In a way, they're a unique class now, the class of 2020, right, is going to be looked upon differently, hopefully, than hopefully next year at this time, we'll be able to do those things. But I think you're absolutely right that finding the special ways that are meaningful to your group, your community, your family makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I agree with you that unexpected events, changes, there are losses and there are opportunities too. Mm-hmm. Opportunities to do things that we might otherwise take for granted, and not only to see how incredibly special they are, but to find really creative and unique ways of navigating that.
That's exactly right.
Circumstances. So what you referred to early on is the emotional agility that times like this requires. So, I had another question on that, and then I just have a few short wrap-up questions, and that is, since we know that the personal rituals, that rituals in general are important, let's talk about what people can be doing just personally in their own lives without it being graduation or a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah or end of life. What are the rituals that we could be doing just in our day-to-day life to help sort of give us a sense of maybe purpose or power around ritual at this time?
It's so great. It's such a great question. And so let's set aside the kind of situational or circumstantial milestone sort of big life events and talk about the ways that we can use ritual to enhance our experience as we're staying at home or safer at home. We're all in different phases of these things right now, but people have been sharing with me the most amazing things that are happening, and you can read it in, some of the reflections in social media and in the news outlets, etc. But they're spending time with family in ways that they didn't. So recreating the family meals. And I just heard a story yesterday of someone who said they had recreated a Sunday meal via Zoom with kind of grown siblings so that they were now having a Sunday meal. And they thought it was a one-time thing, but they enjoyed it so much that now it's become a weekly ritual that they share. They each prepare meals at their own homes, of course, but then they share the experience via Zoom. And so I think you're hitting on something really important, which is that ritual can help us kind of lessen our anxiety and maybe help us cope in difficult situations, difficult circumstances, but they can also bring forward joy and pleasure in, what might otherwise be just another mundane day at home here now that it's been day 50 or whatever it is for many people. Other examples are, I think there's a rise in what my mother would have called domesticity. So kind of homemaking, making our homes more comfortable or more livable, or really engaging in the spaces that we're living in ways that we didn't before. And for some, that might take the form of organizing and spiffing things up and those sorts of things. But for other people, it's a meaningful connection with the spaces that surround us. People are baking, people are doing kind of claiming some rooms that might have been like pass-through rooms or rooms that we didn't spend much time in. Now we're all here all of the time. And so we need to really think about how do we settle in and really experience this living space as a home. So many different ideas that people are doing. It's spring here in the US, so a lot of people are now finding moments with nature, even though they can't get out and go out in groups in the way that they might have. Being alone or being with another person that they live with is really giving people an opportunity to look at the day-by-day changes of the buds coming out on the, trees, or the flowers that are just peeking through the earth in a way that they didn't notice it before. And so those are meanings. I don't want to, make too much of it, but those are the kinds of appreciating beauty that can really lead to transcendent experience, that can really make us feel that our life is full, even though we're in circumstances that we wish were otherwise.
So we come back around then, Jan, to the idea that by using creating habits out of something, by creating a practice out of something, we can really bring a kind of sacredness to even the mundane.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And
And
that's what allows us to have the sense of transcendence.
you've got it, Jen. That's exactly right. So instead of kind of thinking of, all of what we used to do between, like, let's say 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. as the things that we do to get out of the house, now we can take a time with those things, and we can realize that preparing a meal, or enjoying the first cup of coffee, or sitting outside and listening to the birds, those are all things that maybe we weren't fully taken advantage of, when our lives were busier. And I think the question that remains, and I think ritual is one way that we can get after this, is when we look back on this time, what are the stories that we want to tell about how we lived during these times? And are we doing the things each day that will allow us to, with authenticity, be able to share those stories in that way? And this has been a difficult time for people, even who haven't had tragedies like loss of family members and loss of employment, all of those things that are so hard for people. But even if it's just someone sheltering at home, it's a difficult experience. And so none of us are perfect. We have our ups and downs every day, kind of that emotional agility. So, we'll be angry at one moment, and maybe a tear will fall at another, and then maybe we'll just have moments of joy afterwards. And so that's just the daily experience of being in such uncertainty and such different circumstances. But I think the question about story is kind of, what's the arc? What's the narrative of what we're doing, and how do we create rituals, practices? How do we make sure that the activities that we're doing each day will line us up for the story we want to tell about it in the future?
Jan, you share this in common with all of the great resilient teachers who I've had the privilege of having interviewed, Karen Rivich being one of them,
Sure.
Rick Hansen being another. Like this idea of the way that Rick worded it was, raise your eyes to the horizon, glance forward and then look back from that space. How do you want to remember this time for yourself? And actually it was Tim Ferriss and Ryan Holiday in a conversation. And I think it was Ryan Holiday said, what if we treated this like sacred time?
Mm.
There was just something about that shift in perspective. What if we treated it like sacred time? And I've heard you quote Annie Dillard about how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. And how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. And isn't that, when could we be more consciously aware of it than now? We could just sort of tighten up and want to just get through this. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just sheer survival.
Yeah.
But we do have options now, don't we? And
we absolutely do.
Yeah, one of the things that we could do is see this as sacred time and find ways to make the ordinary things of the day become more rituals, and that those rituals allow us to experience this in a different way, come through it in a different way.
Beautiful. Absolutely. Absolutely true.
Thank you. All right, so I have three quick, well, maybe they're not quick questions, but they're final questions.
Okay.
That I ask of everybody that I have the privilege to interview. And so the first one is, nobody that I've interviewed has the luxury of being an outsider sort of looking in. Sometimes we can be asked about something because we have a special area of expertise, but not necessarily something we're going through. Well, guess what? Collectively, we are all going through this. And so I love asking the experts that I'm interviewing, so what are your best practices right now, Jan? Do you have one or two that you could share with our audience outside of ritual or ritual itself? Maybe it's a ritual you've created. What are the best practices that you're using that are helping you navigate this time right now?
Well, it's a good question. And I think one of the things that I have done that is making a big difference for me is beginning to time segment my day. So it's a bit more of a routine, I would say, than it is a ritual. But I have clients that I work with who are in many different time zones. And so there's a tendency to want to respond right away and to, begin work very early and keep going until the later time zones are in. So I've learned to really segment my work and to have my expectations about what I can accomplish in any given day make sense. So before the pandemic, I think I still have a tendency to take on too much, so I'll confess that. But before the pandemic, I think I approached, with gusto, many different things simultaneously, and including a pretty busy travel schedule. And now I'm learning that focusing on what can be done in any given block of time is really a beautiful thing. And that seems like such an obvious lesson, but when you're kind of hurriedly going from trip to trip and, working with leaders in all different settings, you're kind of preparing for the next session, that gets done, you're on to the next one, et cetera. So really being able to time segment some of those things. On a more kind of like different train, I've taken up the mandolin. So I've been practicing playing the mandolin, and that's been just a delight to be able to do that. I have a 2-year-old grandson and also a 3-month-old grandson, but my 2-year-old and I have a daily ritual of sharing snack together and reading stories, telling stories, etc. So there are lots of things that are, I wouldn't have been able to do it in the same kind of daily dosage that I'm able to do it now. So I'm really just kind of relishing in it.
I love it. And I love that idea of meeting your grandson every day for story time. Again, these are some of those things that we want to remind people of are accessible to us.
That's
or
right.
If they are accessible and we're not taking advantage of them, to allow our creative minds to really open up about, okay, so we know what we can't do. And maybe instead of spending a lot of time, too much time being resistant to that, allowing our minds to open up to, so what can we do? And I love the story time for your grandson. And I'm going to borrow the Sunday dinner one too. I like that. My poor kids. One more. I've got 20-something-year-olds, so they're going to love this. Okay, I'll tell them Aunt Jan said this.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Here's the next question, and that is, Jan, what are you grateful for? What are you grateful for today?
Yeah, I am so grateful for so many things. So of course, first and foremost, the people who are caring for us. So I, am a Midwesterner at heart. And one of our things is kind of not bothering people and being grateful and being neighborly and kind of, nice, at least on the outside, kind of an affect, right? And so I find that like going to the grocery store or ordering food online, I've only really taken restaurant carry out a couple times, and I've wanted to do it just because I wanted to support some of the establishments here. But I find for me that I'm just overcome with gratitude whenever I'm having these exchanges with the delivery person, with the people. Fortunately, I haven't been in a situation where I've needed medical care, or anyone in my close family or friends here have either. So I haven't had to extend, personal gratitude there, but just absolutely grateful for all of that. I'm grateful that the work I do basically is in person. So when you talked about leadership development, organization development, it's often on site, working with teams, groups of leaders, doing leadership retreats. And of course, none of those are happening. So when I got back from a trip that was a multi-city trip, and I got back on March the 8th, I think I had a mid-April event that was canceled. So I have a travel calendar, and I wrote in pink highlighter across the week that I had, where I was going to be canceled. And then shortly after, postponed the next one. Well, now my travel schedule is clear till the end of September. And so for me, that is a different lifestyle. And it felt in the first couple of weeks like slamming the brakes on a fast moving train. Now I'm luxuriating in it. So I'm just really loving it and grateful for the fact that, either an event has been postponed, so there'll be some income for it in a future point, or some of them have been moved online. And we've gotten creative with, instead of doing like a strategy retreat, now we're doing wellness check-ins and the kinds of things that this pandemic environment has made us do differently. So grateful for the work, for the family, for all of those helpers out there.
I absolutely love that answer. And I know the feeling of knocking things off your travel list. I have more credit with more airlines. I could travel for the rest of my life. Okay, last but not least, I'm pretty sure this question will not sound familiar to you because you and I both know the same person who is the originator of it. But right here, right now, given the circumstances exactly as they exist, Jan, what are you hoping for?
That's a beautiful, beautiful question. I'll tell it by way of a story. So I have one child, a daughter, and she's well now, thriving. She's 35 years old. When she was 7, she was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia, and she was hospitalized for 6 months at the shout out to the University of Wisconsin-Madison Children's Hospital. She was inpatient there for 6 months on experimental treatment. And obviously she made it through. She is, a joy to be around. She's a great mom. She's the, mom of these 2 grandsons that I have. But about a year, well, not even a year, 6 months after she was pronounced kind of clear from cancer, and the doctors told me she has about the same chance of getting any kind of disease as anyone else in the regular population. So it was just heroic efforts on their part, using experimental treatments, and we're so grateful for the outcome, of her being healthy. But I went to a therapist about 6 months later, and what I said to the therapist is, I'm a different person now. I was also doing independent consulting back then as well. And I said, I let things roll off a little bit easier, and I'm not so obsessed with, a particular project or deliverable that I used to be. I'm nicer. I'm a kinder person. I'm easier to be around. And I don't want to lose that. And so this was in 1992. And the therapist kind of didn't know where to go with me on this. And so I ended up not making a long-term engagement with the person, but, they said kind of like, well, I think you're fine. If you're recognizing those things, that's great. You're fine. And of course, I've worked with other therapists on different things, and including during her treatment time. But so my hope for today is that there are lessons for me in this pandemic experience that I can carry forward that will help me be a better person, that will help me be a better friend, a better mom, all of the things, all of the different hats that we all wear in society these days. But even more than that, Jen, I hope that happens for society as well. So I truly hope that when you look at some of the news sources and you see, nature recovering and the air cleaner and streets without honking horns, and, obviously we have to have a kind of a happy medium. What is going to be the new state of cities, state of our communities after the pandemic is, after it's safe to kind of be out and about. But I hope we don't lose these lessons. I hope that we as a society can glean what are the things that are most important to us, and how can we ensure that we keep those going for years and years to come.
Oh, Jan. Oh, boy. From your lips to God and the universe and, the Earth's ears, I could not agree with you more. Jan Stanley, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge, your experience, and most especially your heart with us today. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you tremendously. And thank you for giving us an opportunity to think about this time differently, and about how we can meet this time, and the way in which rituals can help us navigate it. So, my friend, thank you.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you for all the many good works you do with the Heart Initiative and beyond that. So hats off to you for making a big difference in our world.
Thank you. Thank you.